never been done before. It was a English-speaking mandate, right? It was run by the British. It was owned by the British. And what happens in many post-colonial countries, all over Africa, for example, there are countries that speak French. Why do they speak French? Because French was the colonial language, and they became independent, but they kept the colonial language. It was sometimes negative because it had the idea of being colonial, but it was necessary because maybe they had 85 tribal languages, and that was the common language, okay? And what in Israel they should have done in those terms is to keep the English. It would have been much more practical. But what did they do? They revived Hebrew. This had never been done in history. And by reviving Hebrew, people who had never spoken it started writing children's books and teaching children Hebrew. It is, just think how hard it is for us to get people to accept they as a pronoun, even. Just one pronoun, right? Now imagine reviving a whole language, okay? Which is not my topic here, that's for another course. But it's relevant here because once that did happen, and it's amazing that it happened, it changed the image, what I just read you. Hebrew now became a spoken language. So it became the local language, and it became the language of local power rather than just a religious language. So it changed. But Yiddish got even less status because Yiddish was suckling your child in Yiddish. But what happened after 2 generations in Israel? Nobody spoke Yiddish. That's right. It's just those damn immigrants and those survivors of the Holocaust and all that. So the Yiddish lost status tremendously. So when we have this diglossia, triglossia, or whatever, and we write down what is the situation in each country, that doesn't mean it's going to be always the same. There is going to be economic, social, and other changes in Israel, a tremendous change that meant that the gendering and power structure of these languages changed, okay? So, example 3, then our big example, Susan Gall, the first article written on this. What is the location? It's Austria, but the real location is a little Hungarian-speaking enclave village that's left over there, right? And so their high language is Austrian German, which is problematic because the Germans actually look down on Austrian German, and probably some of those boyfriends they caught from the bra factory speak a very low-class German, actually, and she doesn't get into that, funnily enough. I don't know why. So, but to them, it was a high language because it was the language of the majority. So what were they trying to do? They're a minority, right? Like an immigrant minority, except with a difference. They didn't move. It was the borders after World War I that moved, so they ended up, they were always considered Hicks because they were from a village and they speak Hick Hungarian. I'm not using these as value judgments, but how the society would look at it. So even if they were in Hungary, they would be poor peasants. And then, but what would they want to do then? What would those girls want to do? They'd want to go to Budapest and work in somewhere there and marry there, right? But here, the city, even a small city, is not going to be Hungarian speaking. They can't go to Budapest because the borders are closed because it's under communism. And even if they did, they would laugh at them because they only know this village Hungarian. So they assimilate to this closest thing, and they want to not just assimilate, but they want to ultimately have language loss. So they don't want to have a stable, like Morocco has some level of stable bilingualism, trilingualism, diglossia, and all that. For them, it's a transitional thing, as it is for many immigrant communities. So you come here, you're an immigrant, your kid maybe will speak your language, maybe not. If your mother is with you because there's a grandmother, maybe your kid will speak. But then your kid will intermarry, maybe already you will intermarry, and then what happens, the kid doesn't speak even if you want them to, and it's lost, right? So this is basically, this community is just very unusual because there's this village there, but in the next generation, if we go back to this village today, remember this was written in the 1970s, there's probably very few people left who speak that Hungarian. But what is the big conclusion as far as males and females? You already told us what the females did, and let's repeat because it's very important. I think you answered it last time maybe. Why do the men not assimilate? Autonomy. And property. They may have a shitty house in the village, but they have a piece of land, and if they went to the factory, what would they have to do? they'd have to work for somebody for wages, and somebody would say, do this and do that. And guys don't like that. This way, they're the boss, and if they're lucky enough to find a wife, she'll be shoveling the shit for them. Except that they don't find one, okay? So here is but this society is basically going to end in a generation. Now, the Dominican one is very interesting. I did that last time, but I didn't, and I wrote this on the board, I didn't do the last word here, the discursive construction of identity, which is, yes, through language, it just means that you are creating your identity as you talk, through discourse. You are performing your identity. And do you remember we did it at the last part of the class, but do you remember what was very interesting about the Dominicans? And in this case, this is the one case that it is not really so much gendered. The examples we see here, although the examples I read to you, several of them were more from girls, but both girls and boys will do the same thing. So it's remember anything about that article? Yes?
They either said that they were like Hispanic, Spanish, or Latinx. So
And what they were not?
Wait, what? Sorry.
And what were they not? Yes, they were all those things. What did they never say they were?
Like actual, like Dominican, right?
No, Dominican they said too.
Oh, okay. Well, I remember like hearing those, and then like they all mean different things though, so they kind of like wanted to keep like there was an example of a black man, and like a woman was like really surprised that he spoke Spanish, so he would just say that he was Spanish, so that like his identity wouldn't be confused, and that people.
Well, you're answering it. What I'm
Oh,
saying is
okay.
that they never said I am black.
Oh, okay.
So even if somebody said, what is your race? Never mind, where are you from?
Yeah.
You could say, where are you from, or what's your background? Then in principle, you could say a number of things. You could choose, although to say Spanish is very strange for other reasons that we discussed. But even if they say, what is your race? They would never say I'm black, because black to them means American black. And so they identify with their Hispanic, Spanish speaking, and they are performing that. That was a girl, by the way, in that.
Oh, okay.
Doesn't matter. Actually, there it doesn't matter. It could have been. The one where it's very interesting, though, that it was a girl. Okay, so then we say, well, they're so Hispanic. Okay, they're performing that. But in the next example, and your example is perfect for that. But what was the next example?
She was really turned off by this boy that she went on a date with.
Yes.
And who was very in touch with his roots.
Well, not just his roots. He was off the
He was
boat.
speaking in Spanish. And
Yeah.
He would tell her Nina, and she.
Yeah, he was just off the boat, actually, so
Oh.
she was born here, and she could speak Spanish, because I think her mother or her grandmother didn't even speak English, so it wasn't that,
It was kind of a second generation.
it's a generation change, and that's very important, and you want to remember that, because in the last unit, we're going to have gay Mexican-American guys and Mexican guys, a wonderful article about them, and you're going to see in the gay world exactly the same thing. The Mexican-Americans who are putting down the other Mexicans who listen to different kind of music and just speak Spanish, and they're basically hits to them, okay? So your discursive construction of identity isn't just being Spanish and Dominican, although that's what they say. Within that, there is already something that plays out as if it were a class difference, but it's not really a class difference, because they're not any richer or anything like that, but just they're more Americanized. And she gets upset, even though she's Spanish. Speak English, speak English.
And something that was weird was she would get mad for his use of like niña,
Yeah.
but then she would refer to her friend as like loca and stuff.
Yeah.
Like that. So she would continue to like cement her identity as a Hispanic girl, but then she would like reject that at the same time.
And promoted her bilingualism in a sense, right? Because that was a little bit like the Saudi women who were being cosmopolitan because they could speak English. So I'm not just someone who is in the barrio and can only do that. I have a broader identity. Okay, so we stop there. Okay, so then the next one, which I'll just spend 2 minutes on, but just to give you another society. So in this society, everybody in the Dominican community, whether they're just Spanish speaking, whether they're bilingual, whether they've lost English but still call themselves Spanish, they're all involved in this, even though the individual language abilities may be different, right? So they're still constructing their identity around this Spanish thing, and that's the ultimate thing, that you can be Spanish, even if we had a third example, not this girl who says, speak English, even though she's bilingual, but she could have a younger sister who no longer speaks Spanish, and that happens all the time, or very badly, but she'd still say, I'm Spanish, I'm Dominican, I'm not black, right? So it's still, the Spanishness still constructs their discursive identity. Okay, the last one of this group is Monica Heller, Gender and Bilingualism in a New Economy. It's about Canada, and what is the situation in Canada? You could say it's intrasocial, that within the society but there's bilingualism, but that's not really true. How is the language situation in Canada? There are 2 languages, but how are they set up? High and low, or multilingual, or how?
Geographic.
It's geographic. So 98% of the Anglo speakers can't speak French. They have to take it in school, but they really can't. The French speakers in Quebec are kind of the same. They also don't speak, but there are more French speakers who speak English or who try to learn English than English speakers, who are the majority. Even a city like Montreal, which has now become kind of half and half, and there is an English language university and a French language university. They like coexist, okay? So that's a different situation than the high and low. But nevertheless, what this article is about is how in Francophone, so in Quebec area, the females, those females who want to have better jobs, they learn English. No different from articles we didn't get to read in this class anymore, in the older articles when they talk about working class, where the guy may be a construction worker or a truck driver, so he can say, I don't know nothing, and it actually gives him solidarity, what we said before, group solidarity, and it's not important for him to learn to speak elegantly. In fact, it would be counterproductive, because his friends would make fun of him. Whereas his wife or girlfriend can't go with that kind of English to become a pink-collar worker as a secretary or something, so she aims to speak more correctly to get a better secretary job, right? It's because she doesn't want to be a waitress, for example. So, again, language becomes symbolic capital and real capital. So in Francophone Canada, the same thing happens, that language, in this case English, becomes commodified. It's a commodity. It's like having an extra BA, or you got your MA instead of just going to high school. It's an educational thing, and that in turn, what does it do though? By possessing that commodified capital, it changes your identity, right? Like you say, well, I have a PhD, right? So that means I have something. So I can speak English, it gives me something. And we don't have time to read the article, but what is very interesting is that it is many more women who do that. So in every society, linguistically, it tends to be, except in very traditional societies where women weren't allowed to go to school at all. Obviously, I'm going to see that in Morocco a little bit. It's the women who aim to use language, a foreign language or the high language, as a way to gain significant capital and hence identity. And what is interesting in this article is one sentence I will read to you. She says, in Francophone Canada, I've paid attention in particular to the more recent shifts from, quote, a modern industrialized economy to a globalized one based on services, information, and communication. So what does that mean? Let's look back at Gal's article again. That was in 1979, I think. What change was she seeing? She was saying here was a rural economy, which was changing to industrial economy, right? So it's factory work. So it was the women who managed to make that transition, while the guys preferred to stay back on the farm. They didn't go to the next step. But what is she talking about here now in the 2000s? She's not talking about farms. She's saying now everybody by this time is in the industrialized economy, but the next step is you're not going to get a good enough job with that, right? The factory jobs are dying out. Now we have service economy, information economy, communication, and what do you need for that? How do you get a job in that? Language, not just the foreign language. First, that you can write, that you can read the the computer books. You can't learn computers if you're not literate. So a higher level of literate